Welcome everyone to our webinar today. I see folks are starting to trickle in. As you're coming in, please take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat, drop your name, your organization, if you've got a affiliation you want to share. Would love to hear where you're coming from today, where you are, and just who you are. We're excited for you all to be here. A special shout out to the Spoonfuls staff, our board members, our partners, and the other supporters who are joining us today on this Food Waste Prevention Week, alongside a range of people from all over the country. It's great to have everyone here to explore with us the ways issues like wasted food, food insecurity, and the climate emergency intersect. So I'll take a couple minutes to introduce myself and what we'll be talking about today. So my name is Liz Miller. I work on the public affairs team at Spoonfuls. We're a food recovery organization based in Massachusetts. We work with hundreds of partners to get still good food from where it is to programs and people that could use it. Our frontline team sources perishable foods that includes fruits, veggies, dairy, lean meats, baked goods, and more. And we work with grocery stores, wholesalers, and farms to do that. And we deliver the food same day to area food programs, including pantries, meal programs, shelters, after-school programs, the list goes on. To date, we've kept over 33 million pounds of good food out of landfills, over 4.7 million pounds last year alone. And the food we recover reaches more than 55,000 people each week. So we are online at spoonfuls.org. We'll drop our website into the chat for anyone who's interested to learn more about us. Our hope today is that you walk away from this webinar with a deeper appreciation of the ways that wasted food impacts the planet and everyone who lives on it, especially if you're somebody whose work lives heavily in the food insecurity space. We hope you'll be able to better connect the dots between the climate emergency and its impact on the food system today and into the future, and find ways to learn, share, and take action after this webinar. We have a little under an hour to get today, so we're barely going to scratch the surface on this really big topic, but we hope that you'll leave feeling inspired to continue your learning. Before we jump into our panel, I want to remind everyone, and I see you all in there now, that the chat box is available throughout the webinar. So please do feel free to drop questions or comments there at any point. We've got folks monitoring that on the back end. And we hope to have some time at the end of the conversation to take up some of your questions with our panelists. If you are one of our Spoonfuls partners and you've got any questions specific to our work together, I just ask that you connect with us directly on that. And again, folks are keeping an eye on those questions in the chat if they do come through. But you can connect with us. You know how to reach us. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists today. We are joined by Irene Lee. She's the chef owner of May Dumplings, a woman-owned farm-focused food brand based in Boston. Irene is winner of the James Beard Foundation 2022 Leadership Award. She is a culinary board member at Spoonfuls, and in 2023 published her second cookbook, Perfectly Good Food, a totally achievable zero waste approach to home cooking, which she co-authored with her sister Margaret. Welcome, Irene. Happy to have you here. Also joining us today is Chris Beling, project engineer for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, for New England Region 1. Chris has worked on food waste issues since the 90s, and now with issues of wasted food in the mainstream, and with the EPA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture having committed to reducing food waste and food loss by 50% nationwide by 2030, Chris is working with businesses and institutions in New England to promote food recovery and provide technical assistance to support this goal. Welcome, Chris. And last but not least, we have Dr. Megan Mayer, assistant professor in the Department of Nutrition and Health Studies at Framingham State University and campus sustainability coordinator at FSU. Megan teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate courses, and her areas of specialty include sociocultural aspects of food, community, nutrition, and agriculture and food systems. She holds a bachelor's degree from the George Washington University and received her master's and PhD at Tufts. Hello and welcome, Megan. So I'm going to jump right in to maximize our time together. And I'd like to start with you, Chris. Recognizing that the answers to this question can spur some anxiety, we still feel it's really important to touch on it right at the top and to ask you, What happens if we don't take action to curb our wasted food footprint? So what does that mean for the planet and for all of us who call it home? And specifically, what does it mean for the food system and our food supply? Why should those of us who care about hunger also care about the health of the planet and vice versa?
Great. So we're going to tee up some slides, and I'm going to start off by just kind of bringing us to the conversation. So Liz, thank you for the invitation to join the webinar today. So being from the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, I'm going to focus on the environmental and climate framing to kick us off on this conversation. So minimizing environmental impacts of food waste is EPA's main driver for doing this work, even if the benefits for achieving our goals go well beyond that. And that said, some of the most satisfying work I've done to date is promoting food donation policies. And I'm excited to join today's event hosted by Spoonfuls. So what I want to do is I want you to think about all the food we waste. And Irene and I were just talking about that. We all waste food. Don't let yourself think you don't, because you do. When we all waste food, there's resources that going into producing and processing and transporting and retailing and preparing it, all that go to waste. And you know that, but it bears repeating that it takes an incredible amount of resources to get food from our plate to our plate, excuse me. And disposal of food waste has various impacts too. The environmental impact of wasted food in the US is substantial and often overlooked. So if we do some modeling, it's equal to 50 million gas-powered vehicles on the road per year, 60 coal-fired power plants, and requires enough water and energy to supply 50 million homes each year. This is data based on collected data from 2021, and we published a bunch of reports that really talk about the footprint of waste and really talks about the actions that impact climate change. So the first message here is there is a clear connection between climate impacts and food waste management. And again, often overlooked. So let's go to the next slide. So when we think about actions to reduce climate change, we think about decreasing our carbon dioxide or methane emissions to the atmosphere. So let's talk about that, how we manage food waste and what ends up being trashed. So the wonky words are municipal solid waste landfills, right? That's where our trash mostly goes in this country, are the third largest source of methane emissions in the United States generated by human activity. So that's beyond transportation and the electric sector. It's what we throw out. And it's about 14% of the emissions in our country in 2021. Now, nearly a third of that waste, known as trash, is organic waste, food, yard waste, tree trimmings. About 2/3 of that is food. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. About 1/3 of it is just all organic waste. Break that down to 2/3 of that is food. And half of it comes from our homes, you and me. Food is the single most common material found in landfills, comprising about 25%, 24%. So think about that. 1 out of every 4 trash bags disposed of in this country is food waste. So those of us who have spent time on this issue suspected that landfill emissions from food waste, i.e. climate change, impacts to climate change, would be significant. And wow, did the numbers of our new report quantifying methane emissions from landfill food waste deliver. Food waste decomposing in landfill does in fact have an outsized impact on landfill emissions. In 2020, an estimated 58% of the fugitive emissions, that means emissions that just go to the atmosphere and that impact climate change, from our landfills are from landfilled food waste. 58%, even though only a quarter of what we put in our landfills are food waste. What these findings really highlight is the need to do everything we can to divert food from landfills. Next slide. So again, I talked about data. Let's show off our new food waste scale. I hope in the chat I see some thumbs up that you've seen this. It's a brand new scale. We've just published it this fall of 2023. But many of you may have affection, as I do, for the food recovery hierarchy. I have it in the bottom right, our inverted triangle with source reduction at the top and feed the people on the top 2 tiers. The triangle was from the 1990s, and even though I was around in the 1990s, I didn't have anything to do with it, but it's not really based on science. It's based on social and emotional factors as well. But in the results of our new field to bin report, we have a new wasted food scale. And again, hopefully most of you have seen it. It's available in 8 languages. We have simple and detailed versions. You can find it on our website. Please use it and share it widely. Pathways are grouped into a little different tiers that EPA has determined to have equivalency for performance. The scale is also based on environmental performance, not social, not economic. So I want you to keep that in mind. It's also specific to food and not other traditional recyclables. Here's the takeaways and how this can impact our actions working towards eliminating climate change and emissions. Don't make food waste in the first place. And Irene is going to talk a little bit about that with her work. Source reduction, that's what that means. Donation, thank you Spoonfuls and all the other folks out there who are recovering good, wholesome food that has a second life. And then upcycling, thinking about spent grains into, bars that have, these are the most environmentally preferable pathways because they displace additional food production. So those are where we want to go. The benefits of source reduction, donation, and upcycling are small relative to the environmental impacts of food reduction. So we can, the benefits beyond those three categories, the ones kind of in the middle, are more climate neutral, and they do little to offset the production costs, but yet climate neutral, so we'll keep it there. What we really want to avoid, again, is on the top right, the landfilling and the sewer and wastewater treatment, sending wasted food down the drain. These are where we stand out for their sizable methane emissions. So again, in our homes, please, let's stay away from landfilling our food waste, putting our food waste down the drain, and if we have the option, diverting our food waste to either a composter or an anaerobic digester or some other pathway, but keeping it out of our waste stream. So let's go to the last slide to kind of just have a fun slide to set the stage. I'm in Boston. This is Fenway Park, clearly. Some of you may be familiar with Jonathan Bloom's American Wasteland. He used the Rose Bowl to illustrate how much food waste we have in this country. We took it down here in New England to say that New Englanders, for the 6 New England states, fill Fenway Park every 11 days. So let's face it, there's a lot of opportunity for food to be diverted from waste in the New England area and in the country. So a bad pun here, food for thought. And I look forward to hearing from my colleagues, Irene and Megan, and the audience questions on how to waste less food and mitigate the impacts of climate change. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I think that breakdown of the environmental impact of wasted food is a really great place to start us. And I want to take that to the next level. So thinking about the impact of that wasted food on people. And so really talking about our food system. So this next question is for you, Megan. Some of the folks listening in today who will tune into our recording afterwards are on the front lines getting food to people who need it now, today. So they might be running or volunteering a local pantry or a meal program, or they work for a regional food bank, for example. And they're grappling with that daily immediate need. So sometimes in that situation, it's hard to appreciate the ways that the climate emergency is a today problem too. So could you break that down a bit for us, Megan? How is the climate emergency impacting the food system today, in particular here in the US?
Yes, thanks, Liz. And thank you all for having me today. It was great to hear from Chris to set the stage. And I think, this question is great, but it's very big, right? So there's a lot we could talk about in terms of the climate crisis's impact on the food system. So I'm going to try to kind of pull out just a few key impacts that I see being important for us to consider in our conversation today. So in really simple terms, the climate crisis is making it harder to produce food, and in turn impacts food availability and food cost. The ways that the climate crisis make it harder to produce food include the impacts on our changes in temperature, more extreme weather events, drought, shorter winters. Farmers are forced to change the type and variety of crops they produce, their production strategies, all of which come at a cost to farmers, especially our farmers who have really efficient systems. Needing to make changes to those systems just incur costs generally for them. Crops may need to be irrigated more, which costs more money, but also stresses our water resources, which are already overtaxed. When it comes to animal agriculture, these sources of food also become more complicated and costly to produce because there may be shortages of feed for those animals. They may require more care to keep them comfortable during things like heat waves. But also extreme temperatures can impair animals' ability to produce food products. So eggs and milk production can be impacted by changes in temperature as well. Hotter temperatures and shorter winters also impact the natural life cycle of insect pests and diseases, which can lead to the need to use more pesticides sometimes, but also those insects can lead to more crop losses. Extreme weather events as well are a part of this climate crisis. So things like heavy rains, hail, flooding, they're all extremely damaging to crops. A recent report from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that 2022 was the third costliest disaster event year in history, in which 18 weather and climate disasters led to crop and rangeland losses of over almost $21.5 billion. And this number doesn't account for the infrastructure damage or the livestock losses. It was just the crops. So just the crops that might go to feed people or to feed the animals. And so the impacts from these natural disasters are also huge. So all of this stuff, it makes farming even more riskier business than it normally is, right? For a farmer to put seeds in the ground and kind of hedge their bets on produce that's going to grow in months that they're going to harvest and sell, it's a really kind of risky endeavor to be a part of. And so these challenges that farmers are facing now are passed down the supply chain to consumers through increased food costs. And again, maybe, there's more limited food availability. And this really just scratches the surface of the impacts of the climate crisis on food production. And I haven't even gotten to our rivers and oceans and the impacts that we see in those spaces as well. But I want to also mention a couple other things, including the impact on farm laborers. So exposure to extreme heat, more pesticide use that may be happening due to increased pest pressure, and the diseases that might be more prevalent from pests like mosquitoes and ticks increase the health risks to our farm workers. The majority of laborers on farms are foreign-born and many are undocumented, which brings up a variety of justice issues related to healthcare access, food security, and workers' rights that we don't have time to get into here, but I think they're just important for people to keep in mind when we talk about the food system. Lastly, distribution can be challenging. Our systems in the US are fairly centralized. We have certain areas of the country that produce and/or process specific food products that are then transported over long distances to get to consumers. And so our food distribution system can be particularly vulnerable in the face of things like floods or storm surges or other extreme weather events. And many of you may have, you remember in recent past when we've had issues with food shortages, or even large amounts of food would go to waste before it could get to market because of these sort of breakdowns in our system. So I know a lot of this can feel overwhelming and insurmountable, but I want to say, there are some potential positives that are coming from the changes in our climate that we might be able to leverage to make some of our local and regional food systems more resilient, sort of for better or worse. In places maybe like the Northeast, we may actually be able to grow more food during the year and different types of food that we may not have been able to grow before because of changes in our climate. There also is a lot of potential creativity and room for technological advances to help reduce crop losses and improve our distribution systems. And so I think there's a lot of ways that our country, folks in leadership and scientists and others working in the food system are trying to help us be more resilient. But it really is a challenging problem. It's a wicked problem that we really need to think seriously about. I like Chris is laughing. It's not just my New England use of wicked, but it's a really tricky problem to think about how the climate crisis is impacting our food system and where we can go from here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll share just one statistic that highlights what you shared, Megan, the costliness. I think that the estimated cost of food loss and waste is something like $473 billion. I believe it's equivalent to about 2% of GDP. So it is quite costly. But to your point about the innovation, there are a lot of exciting things happening, I know, in the food recovery space at a minimum. So thank you for that overview. I'd love to turn to Irene. So Irene, as a chef and a cookbook author, you're really heavily focused on preventing wasted food, which we love, of course. So you're on Instagram at Maymay Dumplings and at Food Waste Feast, and you have the incredible cookbook we mentioned before, Perfectly Good Food, a totally achievable zero waste approach to home cooking. And it's all about making the most of the food you have and helping ensure less of it ends up in the trash. So your work really supports individuals to waste less. And I'd like to understand what your lens, why that's your lens, and what kind of impact individuals can have by reducing their own household wasted food footprint.
Cool. Thank you so much, Liz. And thanks, Megan and Chris, for being here. This is such a treat. For us, there are two primary lenses that we bring to our talking about food waste. Number one is the lens of working in a professional kitchen. Restaurants do certainly contribute to food waste, but it is, in many cases, someone's job to make sure that all of the raw materials get turned into revenue in a restaurant. But when you are a home cook, you probably have at least one other job. And so reducing your waste in your home kitchen can kind of fall by the wayside. And so because we started out as home cooks and then grew more into the professional space, we wanted to bring back some of the tips and tricks that we learned from professional kitchens so that people can utilize those more in their homes. So these are things like labeling the items in your fridge or your freezer, because that container of brown liquid, it could be apple cider, it could be beef stock. You might not know until it's too late. And then the second lens that is really important to us is building people's confidence and empowering home cooks to feel more like they can cook intuitively, that they don't need to follow a recipe exactly, that they can use their instincts or the voices of their ancestors who did not talk about zero waste cooking, they just had cooking. And so we really want people to feel like they have some agency and control and can express themselves in the kitchen. We think that's something that is a little bit missing from our kind of home cooking culture today. And we really love being able to tell people, like, hey, did you know you could do X with Y? And I think many of us in the community of folks who talk about zero waste or managing food waste, Allison Mountford from Ends and Stems is here in the audience, and she is an amazing resource also. I think we all remember like the first time we learned that you can do, ABC. Like the first time I learned that you can put a whole lemon in the freezer and just thaw it when you need a little juice or zest, like mind blown. And I will never forget that, right? So there's like an incredible, I think, communal spirit and an attitude of generosity among people who are really interested in food waste that we always want to share with each other. We want to share best practices and pat each other on the back. And, this is a serious topic, as Megan and Chris have made very clear. And so if we can make the solution or one of the solutions fun and delicious and silly, that helps all of us, I think, engage with these issues in a more meaningful way. For me, part of the reason to focus on home cooks is because food wasted at home does make up a big percentage of the overall food waste pie. If you divide that by how many homes there are, it is less. But I think that, as I have more doubts about plastic recycling, for instance, like what are the things that we can all do to pitch in and do our part? And bringing more mindfulness to what we do with food in the home, how we repurpose or upcycle our leftovers, how we make sure that we're shopping more intentionally. I think all of that really helps us come to this conversation with a sense of agency and wanting to make change and be hopeful about what is a very serious problem.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's such a great perspective. Your comment of our ancestors didn't have no waste cooking. They just had cooking. It's a reminder of the times we are in. So it's great to have your guidance on us navigating through those times. It's very
also
appreciated.
They also didn't have expiration dates or best by dates. And we all made it here. So I'll just leave that for now because we could go down a rabbit hole. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Irene. I'll come back to you now, Megan, and building on sort of like the individual element that we're talking about here. So you're a member of the Metro West Food Collaborative alongside Spoonfuls. And for those of you tuning in from other parts of the country, the collaborative works to advocate for policies and programs that support equitable access to nourishing, affordable, and culturally appropriate food, with the focus on cities and towns just west of Boston. So in collaborative discussions, and I'm sure in many discussions taking place around food access everywhere in the US, we hear a lot about the importance of the safety net programs like SNAP, formerly food stamps, and WIC. And those, just the importance of those as critical levers to tackling hunger. But thinking more broadly, how can programs like those ones support people to waste less? So how else besides curbing hunger can they have an impact?
Sure. Thanks, Liz. So, as you mentioned, the main goals of programs like SNAP and WIC are to improve food security by providing resources for people to buy food. So the purchasing power essentially is being put in the hands of the consumer such that they can choose what they would like to buy and serve in their household, with some limitations kind of depending on the program that we're talking about. Also, many food pantries work in this way. A lot of them have gone from a model of handing a box of food to someone who is struggling to, feed their family, to having a client choice model where the observer might come into this pantry and see that it looks kind of like a grocery store or a farmer's market. And so the structure of these programs are meant to provide agency to the client, but inherently they should result in less waste, kind of as you hinted at, because if I'm choosing what I am getting from a pantry, or I'm using my SNAP or WIC dollars to choose what I would like to get from the grocery store, it's likely that I'm going to choose things that I know my family will eat, and I will make good use of those resources and reduce waste, kind of as a byproduct of that. I kind of think generally too that folks who are on limited incomes might tend to be more waste conscious in general, not necessarily for the environmental impacts we're talking about today, but because they're conscious of conserving the financial and food resources that they have available to them. I think kind of like Irene's mention of our ancestors and their food practices, just sort of cooking. I think the same could be true of just thinking about people's need to conserve those resources available to them. Another piece that I think is tangentially related to food waste, and also kind of supporting local economies in this whole conversation of being resilient in the face of climate change, is that in Massachusetts we have programs like the Healthy Incentives Program and the WIC Farmers Market Nutrition Program, where clients are able to they're provided with additional funding, basically, to go specifically purchase fruits and vegetables and herbs directly from local farms at farmers markets, farm stands, farm shares, those types of programs. And so this keeps money circulating in our local economy, can help support the resiliency of our local food systems. And I think, additionally is related to waste reduction in that farmers have a market for these products in our local communities. And so, I know the Metro West Collaborative does a lot to support and advocate for funding for these programs as well, so that they can continue to exist for residents in Massachusetts.
Thank you. So I'd like to take it to the topic of sort of taking action on this issue. So I'm going to pose this question to all of you, and maybe we can start with you, Christine. So at Spoonfuls, we talk about the climate emergency rather than talking about climate change, because emergencies require a response and immediate action, and it is that. So, but the climate emergency is like such a big issue that for some it feels really hard to pay attention to what's going on with it and feel motivated to do something about it. So what do you say to someone who says, I want to do something to address wasted food, or I want to do something to address the climate emergency, but I'm overwhelmed? In a sentence or two, how would you respond to motivate somebody to take action in that situation? I'll pass it to you, Christine.
Sure. So first of all, I'm so excited that you linked climate change to food waste, right? Because again, I don't think everyone's really on board with that. So I just, having a forum like this and having chefs like Irene talk about that, I think are so impactful. And then I really do think it's what we talked about our homes. 50% of food waste comes from our homes. We have I popped in the chat our food too good to waste toolkit, which hits on a lot of the topics that Irene talked about. If you measure if you just put your food waste in a bucket for a couple of days, I think it's really an eye-opening experience. And in most of New England, at least I can speak to, we have options now for food waste diversion from our homes. Some are through the municipality, some are for pay. But just that one little step is impactful and is really getting us to think about it. And then once you start thinking about what you throw in the trash can, you do start to think, why am I throwing this in the trash can? Getting back to Irene's comment that there's someone in charge, like a monetary in charge, right? Of why we're throwing this out. And what do we throw out? $1,400 a month, a year for a family of four. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. So I think those two things kind of help us think about it a little more clearly and a little more tangibly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Irene, how would you respond to that? How would you motivate somebody to take action in this space?
I think there's so many reasons to try to reduce food waste at home. I think that certainly saving money and doing your part to address the climate emergency those are motivating for a lot of folks. And if those don't motivate you, it's also fun. Experimenting more with what you eat and cook at home, I think can be a real source of joy. And sometimes, it's a comedy of errors. Like I like spinach in my smoothies, and the other day I figured I would try putting some arugula in because I didn't have any spinach, and like it was a very peppery smoothie. But that is the kind of thing that getting to like have a little science experiment and run your kitchen like a lab, that can bring a little bit of levity and fun. And on top of that, I think we all know the feeling of satisfaction when you turn something that didn't seem usable into something that was delicious. So getting the most out of the food that you've paid for, like if you can turn yesterday's leftover charcuterie board into today's frittata, like, I don't know, when I can do something like that, I just feel like I'm so smart. Like I'm awesome. And again, it's like I think that this conversation and this topic, there have to be parts of it that feel good, that feel satisfying, that please us. And so that's what I would encourage, is that kind of experimentation. Being willing to potentially fail arugula smoothie style, but also to discover something new and then enjoy the satisfaction and pride in that.
And how about you, Megan? What's your motivating suggestion?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Irene shared is related to something that a book I read that inspired me many years ago called The Everlasting Meal. And it's sort of the same philosophy of like, whatever I have available or what I've made today, what can I transform it into tomorrow to continue to make sure those resources are useful? And so I love the example of turning the charcuterie board into the frittata. I think of, how can I save my bones and veggie peels to make stock? Or, I think another tip that I often talk about with my students is using the freezer. We can freeze a lot more things than maybe we realize. And, maybe I'm not going to freeze milk and then take it out and drink it, but I might be able to cook with it or, use it in some other way. And so I'm continuing to transform these really important food resources into something else. I think my other motivation that I would share with others goes back to something Chris mentioned at the very beginning, is that there's so many resources that go into growing our food. And that if we really think about what it takes and reflect on that for hopefully even some amount of time, that it might motivate folks to then think of this food resource as something as more, maybe more important or valuable than sometimes we have time to really consider, because we're all busy and have lots of different things going on. But I think the more that I've reflected on just what it takes to get that food to my plate, the more motivated I've been personally to really try to change my habits around eliminating food waste in my own household.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of highlighting like the value of kind of not like being grateful for your meal as you sit down to it, and just thinking about where it's coming from is really, it's a nice practice anyway you cut it. But so we have a ton of questions pouring in, and I'd love to jump in. I have a lot of questions, but everybody has a lot of questions. So I'd love to take a few minutes now to turn that way. So our team has been monitoring the questions coming through, and I'm going to pass some along to you all. So there's one, I think this is probably a question for you, Chris. The question is from Tony, and Tony asks, is aerobic composting preferred to anaerobic in this discussion?
So Tony, I'm going to have to punt on that and not give you a good answer, but if you want to pop up that food waste scale again so you could see it, there are distinctions in the scale. But what I'd like to bring to your attention more than anything is the composting and the soil health we talked a little bit about moving forward. So composting, you may notice, this is the biggest takeaway from our change, or one of the biggest takeaways. If you look at the triangle, composting was ranked below anaerobic digestion, right? So that has changed, and now composting and anaerobic digestion are on the same slice of the scale, and that is a big a big step for EPA to take. And this is due to well-researched benefits of applying organic soil amendments to our, which are strongest for compost. So AD produces energy, so they're also ranked equally. But if digestate, which is what comes out of an AD, is also being composted, there's beneficial reuse. A lot of words that just basically say compost and AD are great, and let's keep at it.
And this one too, I'll just kind of keep us on. This might also be a question for you, Christine. There's a question from Catherine about the statistics in relation to food waste, and she's wondering if those statistics, and this is something I've wondered as well, if those statistics relate only to the organic decompostable matter, or also the packaging that so much of our food comes in these days.
So that's a great question, and the packaging issue is very top of mind in a lot of ways. But the data is purely the organic stream, so it's just the actual food waste. It's not the packaged materials as well. We can have a whole conversation on, best packaging practices and then depackaging for food waste diversion. But the data is purely the organic stream.
Thank you. A question from Catherine, and I'll open, this is for any of you. Do you have literature recommendations or resources in general that you think that would help us to become more educated about food waste? Your favorite reads, perhaps?
So I'll pop in our website. For those of you with a scientific bent, we have lots of, from farm to fork, from field to bin, talks about the food waste along those chains, and how interested you are in that. EPA's Office of Research and Development, just in the last couple of years, have really quantified this. So if that's your like, I can share those with you, and you can look at the science side of why food waste is an issue and why we're trying to tackle it at EPA.
Right.
I think Irene already put this in the chat, but I know ReFed has a lot of good resources, so I wanted to just call attention to that. It's a little ways up there, but that's one of the ones I would suggest as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I refer to ReFed several times a week in my work, and they are really fantastic resource. I'd like to take a minute to plug here too. This is a bit of a resource as well as an opportunity to take action. So as part of our Earth Month campaign that we're doing at Spoonfuls, in addition to this webinar and sharing more resources, we've created a pledge to waste less. It's the Spoonfuls Pledge to Waste Less. And it is kind of a reflective tool is how I've been describing it to folks. So it is you taking the pledge and making the commitment as an individual to waste less. But as you work through the pledge, it just takes a few minutes. It walks you through some prompts that can kind of challenge you to think about specific areas where you're wasting less, like thinking about date labels and considering rethinking that date label, or being more efficient with how you use your leftovers so they all get used up. So it's a really great reflective tool, and you can use it as your own personal commitment to take action this Earth Month and anytime. And we've also created an audit, a personal food waste audit. So that's accessible on our website as well, spoonfuls.org/earth-month. But when you sign up for the pledge, you'll get an email from us as a follow-up that includes direct access to the audit. So just a little plug for that as kind of a resource to help you kind of get in the game if you want to really ramp up your own food waste footprint reduction. Let's see here. So I'm just looking through some of the other questions we've been getting from folks. And actually, I'm going to take a minute to ask one of my questions, and I think this is a question for any of you. So maybe this is like a loaded question to ask it this way, but I'm going to ask it this way. The question is zero waste achievable? And I guess additionally, like, what are some effective strategies you've seen kind of at the systems level to really like move the needle? Any of you, please.
So I can walk on for the policy angle again. Zero waste, in my opinion, is a goal, right? I'm not sure it's achievable with the way our systems are right now. The circular economy is kind of what we're trying to get to, but I don't think we're there. We're not there yet, right? Let's just say that. We have, from a systems level, we have a toolkit that talks about all kinds of cool things different people have done with respect to food waste and municipal policies, programs with the food recovery organizations, and I could pop that into the chat too. So I think it's a goal at this point in time, and a very hard one to achieve right now.
Yeah, I would also add that when we were working on the subtitle of our book, it was really important for us for it to say a zero waste approach, because I think zero waste is a great goal and not a realistic one for most people at home. Again, if your full-time job is not reducing your waste, then there are a lot of other things that you have to worry about. When we present this book at events or book talks, I think a lot of people are overwhelmed by the number of ideas and suggestions that we present, and we have to say to them, like, no, it's not about doing all of these things. It's about choosing the ones that work for you. Like, this is a toolkit, and whatever tools help you address the challenges that you have in your home kitchen, those are the ones that we want you to take away from this. We were visiting one of our cousins on our book tour, and she was like, oh, I don't want to compost my old salad in front of you. And we were like, that's great. And also, like, we are not perfect. We are not speaking from a place of perfection or even excellence per se, but just from a lot of experience. And I think that that's one of the things that for us is really important when we talk about, the very buzzy phrase, zero waste.
I'm not sure I have too much more to add to what Chris and Irene have said, but I think, I at least agree that it's a very lofty goal. And I think at some point there's probably always going to be some amount of losses or waste that occur at any stage in the supply chain. In a previous life, I worked on a gleaning project on farms, and there's always just some amount of potatoes that are going to fall through the harvester, or carrots that don't get harvested on the edges of the fields. And the time and energy and money that it takes for, say, a farmer to take everything and use it and make sure it has a purpose is just, the payoff is not there in a way that I question whether we would ever achieve, say, zero waste on a farm, for example. I think the idea of a more circular economy and some of the strategies that we've come up with to deal with these levels of waste or losses on the farm level, as well as in other places in the food system, get us closer. But I think it would be very, very hard to get to that ultimate goal of zero waste.
One thing I'll add, just kind of from the policy or systemic perspective, there are, I think, increasingly grocery stores in the US that are taking different approaches to marketing food that is either past date or somehow not at its peak. This is super common in the UK where my sister lives. You can go into any grocery store and buy a bag of wonky apples or wonky potatoes. And so I think seeing more of this and also addressing some of the date issues that we have here in the US is huge. And ultimately, I think that the businesses that deal in food will waste less if and when there's a financial incentive for them. So I know that there are some questions and comments about restaurants and grocery stores. And if we can show that we are willing to pay for food that is perhaps not at its ultimate freshness or perfection, that I think is how we create a lot of change. And of course, we need to keep talking about dates. If anyone's ever spent time in a grocery store dumpster, you know that it is just, it's wild back there and there are so few rules.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're highlighting like this, we have to come at this from so many different angles. And you answered one of the questions I was just going to draw out about sort of like how do we hold retailers accountable? I mean, you touched on that a bit. And I think the work we do at Spoonfuls here is trying to work with retailers to divert the waste that they're creating from landfills. And I see a lot of similar approaches, but more from like the retailers doing the work on their end and like figuring out how to sell it as opposed to donate it. And so I think I just would love if we have about a minute more to take this response a little bit further, if you could, Christine, because I know, Chris, that you work with those retailers a lot and with those organizations. Like what are the trends you're seeing in sort of these different methods happening? And like, are there aspects of it that are exciting you right now, or?
I think some of the source reduction technologies, not to call out a lean path or a food, they're these technologies that actually get in the kitchen and they measure, right? It's kind of a database to kind of get people to, again, think about what's out there. One of my best projects I've done is with K through 12 schools. It's like, why are the kids all throwing out the raspberries, right? Like every kid's throwing out the raspberries, something wrong with the raspberries. Go back to the kitchen and make a different, go upstream, right? That's where we have to go. We have to go upstream and figure out why some of this waste is being created in the first place. So one thing we didn't talk about is K through 12 schools and the opportunities there, share tables, changing menus to get kids to eat things. So I don't know, there's so many opportunities to talk about upstream. And I think that's really where we have to go with this conversation is kind of where Irene's saying, don't make the waste in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. So I guess maybe this is a nice question to close on. This is another question from Tony. I'm a select board member. What can I put on our agenda to lead on waste reduction?
So Tony, I read your question because it was the last one in the chat, and that's where I was going with K through 12 schools. Happy to talk to you about that. That's something you can definitely do on a municipal level or household food waste collection. I don't know where you're from, but that's definitely a municipal responsibility. And we've seen some great examples in the Massachusetts Watertown. There's lots and lots of good examples of food waste collection at the curbside, which again in the 90s didn't exist, even 10 years ago didn't exist.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that we are just about out of time here, and I just would like to really thank you again to all of our panelists for this fantastic conversation. I think it's fair to say we could keep going at this for hours and still be learning. So I'm really grateful to you all for everything you've shared with us today, your insights and perspectives, and to our audience here for all of your questions and all of your shares. This has been really great. I hope that everyone here has been inspired by this conversation, inspired to take action on the issue of wasted food in your life, in your work. And yeah, I think, we will follow up with the many links that we shared in the chat today, and you can get a recording of this from us as well in that follow-up. But yeah, we'd love to stay in touch with many of you and all of you. And I'll just say thank you again. Happy Earth Month to everyone, and take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.